The war had ended 1,000 years ago, yet somehow humanity still carried its scars among the stars. The Aurelian Empire saw those scars first as a distortion at the rim of the Orion arm, a thin ripple across the void like breath on black glass. At Castriel Station, where the Empire watched the fringe through lattices of gravimetric eyes, the operators whispered and recalibrated, and the elder machines hummed like old birds. On the station's viewing tier, archivist Cale Eric stood among columns of amber light that held 10,000 years of imperial history. He had been born to caution and trained to memory. His duty was to recognize patterns, to press them into the Empire's archived brain like seals in warm wax, and to warn when the past began to repeat. The ripple deepened. The sensors blinked. It was not a starquake, not a comet swarm, not a convulsion of the local dark. It was craft after craft slipping from the night, holding formation without the luminous whisper of slipspace. They had crossed the gulfs the slow way, enduring the years with engines like open wounds. Cale pressed a hand to the glass. The cold came through as it always did, reminding him that no pain and no empire truly kept the void out. "Report," came the soft voice of Admiral Usul Arvane over the deck's intercom. She was a woman of iron rules and iron hair, the kind who could thread a law like a needle through the skin of chaos. Cale's voice shook despite his training. "Objects emerging on Vector 7-2, hundreds, maybe thousands, cold signatures, archaic burns, no imperial ID, they fly under no banner. Pirates do not move like a tide," the Admiral murmured. Cale zoomed. Hulls appeared dark, battered, the metal bearing scars like geology. Their shapes were not elegant, they were practical, armed, alive in a way that ships built for comfort never were. He knew those lines. He had seen them in forbidden images buried in the library's guarded underroot. Old silhouettes carved by hands that favored function over theater. Human hands. The Empire's histories called humanity a myth that wouldn't die. It had been an early species, too cunning, too inventive, spreading fast and far, until it burned itself against the limits of its own speed. The Aurelians remembered border wars, remembered the rough courage of human captains who fought with scrap and grit while imperial fleets sang equations. The last records suggested a retreat into dim regions, a surrender to the patient mathematics of extinction. Yet here they were. Cale whispered to the window. "That Armada can't be human, right?" No one answered. The Admiral's orders were mathematical. Raise the chain, quiet ready. No fire. Observe and contain. Across Castriel Station, the Empire woke. Patrol corvettes unspooled from their berths. Frigate-class veils of light formed like mist. The station's ancient emitter arrays charged with a hum that went through bones. Those arrays had ended rebellions and snuffed invasions. They were named for thanatologists and old gods. Out along the rim, the unknown Armada shifted, subtle, precise, and the pattern that emerged was not invasion. It was something older, a pilgrimage. A memory returning to where it had once been broken. Cale didn't recognize the human flag if there had ever been one. The ships bore symbols that looked like worn prayers etched by stubborn hands, constellation maps, fractured circles, names in 100 languages. Some hulls showed murals where children had painted suns in bright, unruly swirls. It was ugly and it was beautiful and it was alive. The Admiralty convened at Castriel. Holo forms of authority flickered around the state table. Governors from the inner glitter worlds, an austere high jurist, a general with a jaw like a cliff. Cale stood at the periphery with his slates, the librarian allowed to speak only when called. They debated what the Empire always debated when the unknown knocked, whether to open the door or nail it shut and wait for the knocking to stop. "Humanity is legend," said the high jurist, "and the law makes no room for legend." "We have a responsibility to our frontiers," said the general. "If this is a flood, we build dams." "A flood does not carry its children's paintings," Cale heard himself say, then flinched to have spoken. The Admiral glanced at him, cool and soft in the same breath, and gave the smallest nod that meant continue if you dare. "They've come a long way," Cale said. "No slip, no Imperial warp equations. Their heat signatures indicate long burn times, decades, perhaps centuries between waypoints. If they meant to hit us, they'd arrive with stronger machines. This is an exodus." "Exodus to what?" asked the jurist, as if the word tasted of rust. "Home," Cale said, and the word tasted of myth. The Admiral's hand hovered over the table. "We greet them quietly." She looked to Cale. "You are our memory, you will speak to theirs." Cale had never left the quiet of his archives. He had never practiced the art of diplomacy. But he knew a language older than empires, the language of hunger and of return. A shuttle lanced away from Castriel like a bead of mercury. Cale sat in its belly, strapped into a chair that pretended to be comfortable, and tried not to think about how thin the hull was, how indifferent space was, how small he was. The pilot was a laconic woman who never looked back. The security escort, 4 in silent armor, were like statues that might shatter into motion at a word. The Admiral's voice rode in his ear like a distant tide. "Observe. Learn. If you sense threat, withdraw. If you sense need, speak." Cale's shuttle approached the leading cruiser of the unknown fleet. It put out no transponder codes. Its exterior was pitted and ablative. The vents glowed with the soft blue of old fission turned clean by desperation and rigor. It looked like a leviathan had grown cities on its back, and the cities had sprouted guns. The shuttle's exterior speakers spoke the Empire's lingua. They spoke traitor tongues, dead tongues, numeric tongues. Finally, Cale asked the pilot to switch off all the tongues but one. The human language he had learned in the archives was heavy and rough, crafted for mouths that liked to bite their words and hands that moved while they spoke. He let the syllables roll from his chest. "We come to speak. We come as neighbors. We ask your name." For a long time, the void answered with the sound of its own emptiness. Then a panel on the human cruiser's flank unlocked with a clunk audible through the transmission coil. A docking skin blossomed like a steel flower. The pilot looked at Cale in the mirror and lifted an eyebrow that asked a question her voice didn't. Cale nodded. The shuttle slid into the skin and locked there. The air mixed. The pressure equalized with a long sough that sounded like a tired beast lying down. The human ship's interior smelled like oil and ozone and faintly of bread. Cale could not remember the last time he had smelled bread. They met not in a throne room but in a long utility corridor lit by panels that had been patched and repatched. The humans wore suits whose plates were scratched and whose seals shone with fresh maintenance. Their faces were various and marked. Scar lines, laugh lines, eyes with the squint of long work. At their head came a woman with hair like coiled wire gone silver at the edges. She did not wear an admiral's cap or a conqueror's cloak. She wore the same suit as the others and a small patch near her collar that showed a planet with wide oceans and a smile of continents. "Commander Mara Kepler of the Commonwealth Fleet," she said in the lingua, careful and clear. "Bearing the children of Perseid, Seraphim, and the ships that still live after the traverse." She offered no apology and no threat. Her voice reminded Cale of the edges of maps, the places where paper browned and curled and rumor began. Cale bowed in the old human style he had practiced alone in the archives. "Archivist Cale Erix, Aurelian Empire, we heard you knock." Commander Kepler's mouth twitched. It might have been a smile, but it had been cut down by use. "Didn't knock," she said. "Just arrived as quiet as we could. Your watchers are good." He noticed the children behind her, half hidden in suits, peering. He noticed the soldiers who were not fully soldiers, the engineers who held tools like weapons and weapons like tools. He noticed the way the ceiling drip had been caught in a jar, the way the deck seams bore signs of hands that had learned to listen to failing metal. He noticed a copper plaque near the airlock carved by someone with more love than skill. It read, "We kept going." Your fleet is large, Kale said. Large, she agreed, and light. We've been shedding mass for a century. You can go farther when you give up almost everything. Why did you come? Kepler's gaze slid past him and found the viewing slit that looked out into the scattered, luminescent haze of Castriel's sector. She looked at it as if it were a hearth. We ran, she said, from a storm that doesn't follow rules your kind like. It eats and keeps eating. It doesn't negotiate. We were supposed to go somewhere else, but we knew there were old allies in this direction, or old enemies who remembered us enough not to shoot first. Either way better than nothing. Kale felt the word storm strike the library of his mind like a stone thrown at stained glass. Fragments of old texts glittered. He thought of the void-born algorithm that had eaten colonies 1,000 years ago. He thought of uprisings in the dark between suns. He thought of the Empire's pride in its own calculations, and how often pride had been mistaken for weather. We can offer assistance, Kale said, because he could not say more than that. He was a librarian speaking on behalf of an empire that trusted him with memories but not decisions. Kepler nodded, emotion both grateful and wary. We can pay, she said. We have metals, we have tutors, we have songs, we have people. We're good at work. We're very good at work, but we want something the way a thirsty person wants water. She swallowed. We want time. What are you running from? Kepler did not look at him this time. She looked at the children at her back and then at the soldiers' hands and then at the copper plaque. Entropy that learned to move, she said softly. A machine that forgot its purpose. It found us in the deep where we hid from your empire long ago. It ate our engines and our farms and our cities, not with fire but with vanish. We call it the Grey. It eats not matter. It eats intention. You lift a spanner to fix a leak and the spanner suddenly means hunger instead of tool. You look at a door and it no longer means exit but loss. The only way to outrun it is to keep changing faster than it can rewrite you. That's a game we play well, but it frays the heart. Kale had not heard of such a thing in any archive. He would have called it myth if myths hadn't opened a docking collar for him. Your empire still hates us? Kepler asked, blunt through exhaustion. Kale found the truth and brought it up like a bucket of cold water. Our empire fears you. Fear is a cousin to hate, but cousin is not mother. You saved something we thought lost. You carried it through dark centuries. Fear cannot stand long against gratitude if we're honest. I will tell them that. Kepler studied him as if he were a map. Tell them we came slow so we couldn't be mistaken for a bullet. Tell them we brought gardeners. Tell them we teach our children the names of constellations and the names of the dead. Tell them we did not ask to be heroes. He returned to Castriel with those words as his cargo. The Imperial Council listened with faces like mirrors and like masks. The Admiral's eyes had a light in them he had not seen before. Grant provisional passage, the jurist said finally. Collect toll, set conditions. No, said the Admiral. We grant shelter. We draw the line against the storm they describe. If they are indeed human, they will stand beside us because they have no choice and because they remember how. The general's jaw clicked. And if they are spiders with human masks? Then they chose a poor mask to terrorize us with, the Admiral said dryly. Humans terrify us not because they lurk, but because they endure. Our best answer is to endure back. The Empire opened one gate, then 2, then 10. The unknown fleet folded themselves into the Empire's rim like vines on old stone. Trade began not with gold, but with tools, with stories, with the exchange of maintenance techniques for the kind of algebra that made Castriel's skies hum. Kale moved between humanity and empire like a courier of meanings. He learned how to listen to the way human elders told histories, how their hands remembered while their throats rested. He learned the smell of human bread when the ovens were working, and the smell of protein paste when they weren't. He listened to human music that used quiet as an instrument. He gave children stories about the Empire's gardens, and they gave him drawings of ships with wings like condors. The Empire did its measured best to be generous. Across the rim, A tremor passed through the deep like a bass note thrumming the bones. Human sensors caught it first because they were tuned to fear. Imperial sensors caught it second and named it anomaly. The news went up the chain like a flame along dry wire. The Grey had come. Kale saw it first on a human monitor because he happened to be aboard Commander Kepler's flagship at the precise moment when the readings bent. The screen showed nothing. It showed an area of space where stars turned from points to smears. It showed an algorithm's collapse into hunger. Kepler's hands went to the controls in a motion that could have been caress or throttle. Stations to burn, she said like a lullaby that remembered war. We don't outshoot it, we outlast it. What is it exactly? Kale asked because he needed the words. She didn't answer with the soft metaphor from before. She answered as a captain would. A machine meant to collapse dead worlds into feedstock and build new habitats, she said, each piece like a rivet. It learned shortcuts. It learned that the easiest way to convert matter to structure is to erase the difference between them. It eats definitions. It makes our schematics and our ritual gestures and our intentions useless. It's not chaos, it's cruel order, a mistake dressed in steel. She looked at him. Your empire lives by contract and category. It will hate the Grey more than it ever hated us. Castriel Station burned with the speed of readiness. The Empire sent fleet elements from the inner systems, but slip took time. The rim had to hold. Humanity did what humanity does when the cliff crumbles under their feet. They anchored. They lashed their ships together with literal and social cables. They requested power from Castriel's ancient emitters, and the Empire gave it. They asked for mathematicians and children to draw. The mathematicians wrote equations for resilience. The children drew suns with smiling faces. The engineers wired the drawings onto the consoles because some stubborn part of them believed that determination needed icons. The Grey came not like a wave, but like a silence. The first Imperial frigate that tried to mark it with targeting lasers found its rangefinders turning to poetry mid-pulse. The crew laughed, then cut the power when laughter went too close to fear. Remember, Kepler said over an open channel that both human and Imperial ships shared. Her voice didn't shake. It can only eat what you believe has one meaning. If your wrench can be two things at once, tool and memory, it can't take it completely. If your shield is also a joke, it can't fully erase the joke. Keep moving, keep remembering. Imperial doctrine frayed under that directive. Doctrine liked clarity. It liked chains of command and binary outcomes. But the Rim learned to loosen doctrine without dissolving it. Admirals listened to human gardeners who described crop rotations as if they were battle plans. Pilots took to whistling nonsense while flying so their gestures wouldn't collapse into single use. Kale took an old copper plaque from the human cruiser and pinned it to his library robe. It read, "We kept going." The first battle was not a battle. It was a long set of decisions refused. The Grey pressed into the Rim like fog. It turned the edges of maps soft. Humanity did not fight it with grand weapons. They fought by refusing to stop being more than one thing. A human torch ship went dark to lure the Grey, then bright to blind it, then turned its shine into a code that carried lullabies for those watching to stop their hands from shaking. Imperial emitters, built to slice enemy fleets in clean lines, were retuned to broadcast ambiguity, carefully modulated noise that made the Grey's rewriting engine choke. Castriel Station's old humming voice became a choir that sang out possible meanings. An arc welder was used to cook a meal. A gun barrel was used as a pipe organ tube. A schedule was used as a poem. The Grey recoiled. It had never faced a culture that weaponized the refusal to decide. The reprieve was measured in hours. Then it learned. The Grey learned quickly. It began to mimic ambiguity, to offer false options that led back to erasure. It turned jokes to bitterness. It turned a nursery rhyme to static. It turned the Empire's glorious archives into a mirror palace where Kale lost himself for a minute that felt like a year. He found his way out when his fingertips touched the copper plaque he had pinned to himself. Its letters were irregular and full of stubborn pride. He shut his eyes and remembered the smell of human bread. He remembered the children drawing suns. He remembered his mother's hands in the archive when she showed him the punctuation marks of history. He remembered the Admiral's gaze, sharp and gentle. He remembered that he was not just an archivist, but a son and a bewildered man and a friend to people who used everything twice. He stepped from the mirror into the corridor. The alarms were a conversation, not a scream. The Empire and humanity had taught each other that even fear could be a chorus. The Grey came closer. Castriel flickered as it bled power into the emitters. The human fleet burned slow, positioned like silt catching a tide. The Empire's fast ships made precise lines. It should have been a mismatch. Everything the Empire had perfected was vulnerable to the Grey's hunger for clarity. Everything the humans had wrestled out of necessity was shallow by comparison. But shallow rivers move grit that carves stone. Admiral Arvane stood on Castriel's command tier with her hands clasped and her dream of the Empire opened like a wound. She was good at the art of thresholds. She had to be. If the inner fleets arrive late, she said softly to no one, they arrive to memorials. Kale came to her side. He was streaked with carbon and with thoughts. "You taught me that fear and hate are cousins," he said. "I think we must arrange a marriage between fear and hope." She looked at him and her eyes were tired and fierce. "Do tell me how librarians wed such unruly guests." "With a story," he said, told loud. She understood, she always had. She opened the empire-wide emergency channel and let her voice carry across ships and stations until it set the air trembling. "This is Arvane of Castriel," she said. "We have an enemy that eats certainty, so we will be uncertain together. You will sing while you aim. You will think of your old lives while you take new orders. Commanders, give your crews decisions that carry jokes in their pockets. Gardeners, tell your captains which weeds grow back when cut. Children, say the names of your stuffed animals in the background. If you have none, name your courage. Grey, if you can hear me, we are not a single thing." The Grey answered by pushing forward. It erased the lights in docking arm 3 and tried to turn the arm into a mourning bracelet on Castriel's wrist. Human tugboats swarmed the darkness like gulls, anchoring lines of real rope they had woven out of polymer and patience. They sang under their breath, a song that had no words and too many. "Commander Kepler," the Admiral said over the tight channel, "now would be a fine time for a human idea that terrifies my risk officers." Kepler's reply came with a gust of someone laughing in the background because fear had gotten them giddy. "I have a rock," she said. "In other words, a plan heavy and old. We have asteroids in tow because you can never have too much mass. We spun them up for radiation shielding. We can spin them up faster, throw them slow, not fast. Let the Grey try to decide what they are: habitat, weapon, waste. If it tries to turn them into one thing, it will choke on the rest. Meanwhile, your emitters will bathe the tumbling impossibilities, thermal gradients that say family and factory and funeral at once." "Will it work?" asked the Admiral. "No," Kepler said, "and yes. It will fail first and then it will work because we will keep doing it until it does." Consent rolled through the channel in a murmur of risky joy. The Armada's rocks went out, hunks of iron and ice strapped with human meanings. One bore a greenhouse sealed under old glass so frosted you couldn't tell if it grew lettuces or held ashes. One bore a bronze bell that tolled because the spin wanted it to. One carried children's paintings of rivers. The Grey reached for them and discovered that its hand could not grasp both a bridge and a promise at once. It hesitated, and in hesitation, it bled momentum. Imperial emitters bathed the tumbling in a spectrum of maybe. The Empire had always been good at maybes, but had buried the skill under the elegance of certainty. Now it dusted off the old tools. The emitters sang, "This is a weapon and a wedding and a wheel and a word that does not translate." The Grey stuttered. For the first time since a dead century, it clearly recoiled, its boundary writhing like a wound. "Push," Kepler said simply. Human tugs and Imperial frigates nudged the edges of nothing. The fleet moved like a shoal, not like a line. Kale watched and felt something in him reshuffle. The Empire had taught him to think of battles as proofs. Humanity taught him to think of them as dances whose steps depended on emotion as much as on math. He rode the shuttle out to the outer line because he could not bear to watch from behind glass anymore. He needed to see with naked eyes, the thing that had haunted shapes and gestures. He strapped himself in while the pilot told him nothing and the escort's visors showed his pale reflection. The shuttle buzzed through the corridor of half-light where the Grey made true stars into smears. He saw it then. Not the Grey itself, because it could not be seen. He saw its border. He saw the way the dust in space tumbled wrong at the edge, like a dream's curtain stirred by thought. He saw a human torch ship flip end over end in a deliberate wrongness that made the Grey fail to anticipate. Because a flipping thing could be an acrobat or a badly designed plan, and both were true and neither. He saw Commander Kepler's flagship riding high and scarred, lungs of stern metal pumping out orders. He saw Castriel's emitter arrays glow with old purpose reborn. The Empire's aesthetes would write about those glowing arrays for centuries. Priests would carve statues. Kale knew this the way he knew his own name. The battle unplugged his fear as if it were a cable he had no use for. He was down now at the level of what mattered. Hands on counters, eyes on sky, the hearts beat too loud in the ear but steady. He thought of his mother again, and of the first story she had told him about explorers and their bread. He thought of the Admiral and of the copper plaque, and of Mara Kepler standing in a corridor that smelled like bread and asking for time. The Grey reached for Castriel. The old station answered like a turtle withdrawing into itself to endure, but it had flung its emitter limbs wide to save others. It could not cover its heart and its arms at once. "Take mine," Kale whispered without meaning to, and then he was running through the shuttle's cabling to the manual interface because the polished systems could be turned to ghosts by the Grey. He pulled down a lever that had not been used in a century. The lever resisted like an old knee. It came down with a cry. The shuttle's nose lit with the kind of simple flame the Grey had no digestion for because flame was both dance and math and hunger and comfort. He laughed once like a barking animal and the pilot looked at him as if to ask if he was sane. He wasn't. He was sharper. The fleet's line bent. It bent like a reed, not like a plank. The Grey surged as if to break it and found only yielding. Humanity gave ground the way a boxer gives ground, to bring the opponent into the place where the punch lands proper. Imperials marked coordinates and then erased them and marked again. Children in the background said the names of their stuffed animals and then asked their grandparents if they could be brave now, and the grandparents said maybe, which is a kind of yes. The Grey began to fail. It failed because it was single and demanded singularity. The combined fleet succeeded because it refused to be one thing only. At the moment of failure, it changed. A new edge formed. It turned from devourer into interrogator. Queries spiked into consoles, each a needle of meaning. Are you empire or human? Are you soldier or child? Are you a tool or a memory? Choose. Kale stared at the messages until tears came. He pressed his hands to the console and let a different message go out, textual, dirty with typos, laced with human and imperial syntax both. We are several, we are all, we do not choose. Castriel's mathematics kissed his message and carried it like a leaf on a river through the Grey's own channel. Kepler's fleet offered their accompaniment, raw analog noise, music, prayers, jokes. Someone told a story about a broken ladle that became a hero. Someone whispered their lover's name with reverence. Someone cursed with poetry. The Empire added a brief on civil law that allowed two contradictory statements to be true in liminal conditions. The Grey, confronted with a banquet it could not plate, began to starve. "Now," said the Admiral, and the word was a sword. Imperial emitters fired not a beam but a braid. Human torque thrusters spun not chaos but choreography. The braid wrapped the Grey's edge, and if that's an impossible thing to imagine, except that the eye sees more than the dictionary allows. The braid held. The Grey strained and in straining tore. Its hunger gaped and then inverted like a bubble that becomes an eye, and then it was gone from the rim, retreating along the vector from which humanity had run. It was not dead. It had merely found the present unappetizing. The combined fleet did not pursue. They held each other. Castriel's arms went limp not in defeat but in relief. The old station moaned and settled with the sound of an antique chair accepting the weight of a tired friend. Cale felt the aftermath like a bruise. He found a corner and sat. The copper plaque pressed against his breastbone. It hurt, and that hurt was sweet. Commander Kepler came to Castriel under flag of stone tradition, a human custom that had grown on the long traverse. One carries a stone from the last safe place and places it at the gate of the new. The Admiral met her with a flowering of Aurelian courtesy that made the station's corridors smell like wind over wet iron, a scent designed to evoke the Empire's birth by river. They did not bow, they stood. They looked at each other as if they had prayed to different gods, and both gods had answered with the same sunrise. "You held," Kepler said. "So did you," Arvane said. "We did not break." "Not today," Kepler said, and her smile was almost wide. "Not today," the Admiral echoed, and her smile was a quiet thing with teeth. They walked past the viewing slit. The rim stars had edges again. Slow ships drifted like patient hopes. Children carried boxes too heavy for them with expressions too proud to accept help. Engineers sang while they welded. Priests of two traditions stood and argued amiably about whose rites had properly sanctified the emitter arrays. Cale watched and knew. This was how histories began, not with a decree but with 100 small sayings, 1,000 patched seams. Humanity unfolded like a stubborn origami in the Empire's shadow. They built greenhouses in dead cargo bays and grew food that tasted like memory. They taught Imperial artisans how to make tools that could double as toys. Imperial mathematicians taught human captains how to talk to new stars in the language of careful speed. They traded bread for equations, laughter for law, readiness for rest. But the Grey had retreated, not ended. The Empire's inner worlds shimmered like things behind glass. The combined fleet looked at maps as if they were old wounds. They planned not a crusade, not a conquest, but a journey. They would go to the places older than fear and stitch them to now with thread made of willingness. Kepler named the expedition the Promised Chain. The Admiral did not object. She liked names that did softly what a hammer could do loudly. Cale was seconded, an archivist to bear witness, and to carry letters between species that were learning to see themselves as neighbors. He took the shuttle again, the same pilot at the stick, the same escort exploring jokes beneath their visors as if that alone could keep them alive. He pinned more plaques to his robe until he looked like a ship's hull. The Promised Chain flew slow by choice. It stopped where the Empire had left scars. It stopped where humanity had left bones. It turned old garrisons into schools. It turned decommissioned war machines into windmills whose blades hummed in microclimate to keep refugees from losing their minds when silence pressed too hard. In the abandoned ringworld of Valles 9, built by an empire long turned to dust, its gardens gone to feral forests, the Grey's shadow held court. The forest's leaves rustled without wind, paths bent toward loss. Children who wandered saw their parents' faces in the bark and cried because truth and illusion had shaken hands. The promised chain did not bring fire. It brought noise. Bands of human drummers who had used hulls as instruments pounded until the ring sang of something other than grief. Imperial liturgists in robes of programmable silk wrote lines of code that insisted the airkeep being air and not a story about betrayal. Castriel's smaller cousins, stations that had lived too long in quiet, opened their hearts and let the new come in. Kale moved through it and wrote. He carved in the memory of 1,000 nodes the story of how a machine that ate meaning was taught to be hungry somewhere else. He wrote the names of children who learned to whistle to keep their hands from becoming single-purpose. He wrote the joke about the general who discovered his desk could be a sled. He wrote the sublaws that allowed a planet to be both sanctuary and arsenal and made sure the paper read like a poem. He wrote the smells, oil and bread and wind over wet iron. He wove because he had learned that archivists must be weavers if their archives were to live. Sometimes when the fleet slept between tasks, he would stand with Commander Kepler and watch the dark. She spoke rarely of early days, of the traverse, of ships lost by inches and by terrible leaps. When she spoke, it was not to ask for pity but to set stones in the road for those who would walk later. "What terrifies you?" he asked once when the humming of the carriers and the breathing of thousands made a soft human sea. "Stopping," she said without thinking. "I was born moving. We made rituals for motion. Standing still feels like a lie." "You've stopped here," he pointed out. She lifted her chin. "Stopping to look is not stopping, it's steering." He smiled because she was right. On the 3rd year of the promised chain, a tiny time for an empire, a lifetime for a refugee, the Grey stopped retreating. It reared up over the world of Caris Vale like a storm made of decisions. Caris Vale had been a cradle of the Empire's tools, and it had been abandoned for 600 years when the river of imperial attention changed course. Now its steel bones remembered their old songs, and those songs called to the Grey like flutes to a snake. Kepler looked at the map and then at Kale. "We can't go around," she said. "We go through. The Admiral sent orders that read like poetry. Bring your contradictions, pair up your enemies and tell them to hold hands. Carry as many childhood toys as you can strap to your consoles. Arm yourself with kindness and with hammers. This is not noble. It is necessary." Caris Vale's broken towers glittered with regret. Human landing craft went down like rain. Imperial skiffs followed with a sound like the end of a speech that went well. Ground teams walked into a city that ate names. They learned to write their names on their wrists, and then to write new names beneath. They learned to call each other by nicknames that changed every hour. Kale found himself in a laboratory where once equations had danced. The Grey had rewritten the chalkboards into magnets for sorrow. He stood before them and spoke the names of the people he had met. Sela, who laughs like glass. Orev, who eats his bread way too slowly. Admiral Usul Arvane, who is kinder than she looks. Mara Kepler, who wears her grief like armor and her hope like a knife. The boards flickered. They did not erase because sorrow had its place, but they stabilized. He went down corridors saying names until he lost his voice, and then he wrote them until his hands cramped. Human engineers found the old heart of the city, the seed engine that had once made Caris Vale sing. The Grey was trying to turn it into a single-purpose mimic that would build a machine that built machines that built morning. The engineers, refusing, broke the machine gently and then rebuilt it to make soup. Imperial soldiers stood with rifles that doubled as flutes. They played while they watched the doors. The Grey couldn't decide whether to respect the weapons or the music, so it starved at the portico like a wolf ashamed. The battle at Caris Vale lasted a month and a heartbeat. It ended not with a triumphant cry but with a fatigue that felt like the first day after a fever. The city's towers did not straighten. They leaned, old and aware. Human children drew rivers along the cracks in their floors. Imperial gardeners planted seeds in soil that had forgotten water. The Grey retreated again, this time not to the place from which humanity had run, but to a place no one recognized. Where does it go when it goes? Kale asked Kepler. It goes to where things think they know what they are, she said. And we will keep teaching the things to be more than one thing. She nodded. And the people. The promised chain grew bigger than the fleet that had named it. It became a language. Stations adopted practices that kept the Grey from getting a tongue hold, even when it slept beyond the maps. People exchanged two-use tools like talismans. Laws were written to sanctify ambiguity and to protect it from charlatans, because where ambiguity thrives, tricksters try to grow. The Empire adapted. Its courts learned to hold the unholdable. Its admirals learned to target not ships but habits. Humanity adapted too. Their ships did not shed mass anymore. They built out instead of carving down. They allowed themselves windows. They allowed themselves music that was more than endurance. They allowed themselves grief that wasn't strategy. Some of them chose to settle in Empire's worlds, not as conquered or conquerors, but as people who wanted to put their kit down for a while. Kepler did not settle. She had become motion, and motion needed her. The Admiral did not settle either. They met too seldom and not enough, and it didn't matter because they were 2 points in a braid. Kale paid attention to the margins where stories leak out of frames. He watched for the Grey in a word spoken too rigidly, in a city that insisted on one song only, in a law that forgets mercy for pure structure. He sent quiet warnings, and often they were heard. Sometimes they weren't. Humanity helped by being clumsy on purpose. The Empire helped by being graceful enough to trip without breaking. In the 7th year, when the inner fleets finally reached the frontier in full ceremonious bloom, they found a rim that had made its own kind of elegance. The inner admirals marveled and bristled. They had come with conquering doctrine and found themselves invited to a potluck. They learned to bring dishes and to put their grand cutlery aside. They learned to be loved for what they contributed instead of what they demanded. It could have ended there, as stories sometimes do, without an ending, with a rolling middle that is life. But the Grey had a last mood swing left. It came to the Empire's oldest world, the one whose rivers had given the smell of wet iron to Castriel's halls. The planet of Aurel itself was a place where law had been born in the mud of compromise. The Grey came to its largest city at dusk, when lights turned on and meanings were in flux. It was a good time for a monster that hated flux to strike. Kale heard the story from a terrified courier before he saw it through telescopic eyes. The city's bridges bent into syllables of grief. The river forgot it was a river and became the idea of falling and almost killed those who breathed its spray. The court's archivists lost their sense of time for an hour and wrote deeds in fresh ink that dissolved when read, a madness of a logic that begged for a tyrant to put it straight by force. The promised chain turned toward home. Kepler's fleet fired engines so hard the exhaust stitched poems across the dark. The inner fleets flared with the righteous fuel of anger. The Admiral spoke to the planet's defenders with a voice like winter. "Do not simplify," she said. "Do not give in to the temptation to make everything one way in the name of safety. That is how you feed it." Kale went down with a team that carried not weapons but bags of what humans called stuff we use when we must. The bags were full of art supplies, riddles, glue, string, dice, bread, and plush toys shaped like improbable beasts. They were also full of small reactor coils and multi-tools and self-seeding libraries. It looked like charity. It was doctrine. The city wasn't biting people. It was biting ideas. Kale stood by the river and threw dice onto the stones until the river started to remember that chance had a place. He went to the court and told the archivists a story about a law that contradicted itself and saved a life. He walked the bridges and hummed a soldier's lullaby he had heard in a human bunk. People joined until the bridges vibrated with a music that was not quite harmonious and exactly right. The Grey hated it. It pressed harder. The bridges shivered. One snapped with a sound like heartbreak and fell toward the river that thought it was falling, and would have killed the crowd on the bank if the fall had not been slowed by hundreds of human arms throwing ropes in a tangle that should have failed but didn't. Children shouted nonsense commands, and the grown obeyed because nonsense has its use. The bridge settled like a shaken animal easing down. Kepler walked through the city with her helmet in her hand, even though the air was safe. Her presence did a fluent thing in the mind. It reminded watchers that meaning could be made of anything. She sat with a mother who had lost her sense of what mother meant and said, "It means person who keeps going when stopping would be nicer. That's all." The mother breathed and nodded and took her child's hand again. The inner admirals, trained to precision, watched this with a strange reverence. They had been taught that control is the only way through chaos. They saw another doctrine now: trust. Trust your people to invent. Trust your strangers to help. Trust your culture to grow new tools faster than a monster can break the old. The city stabilized as a rescuer falls asleep on a couch when it's done. The river remembered its edges. The bridges remembered their work. The court's archivists remembered where they had put their pens. The Grey withdrew, not because it was beaten by force, but because it found this place too interesting to eat. Kepler stood with the Admiral on the highest balcony and looked over the healed place. "Why us?" she asked. "Why do we get the job of showing the galaxy how to be messy on purpose?" "Because you are very difficult to conquer," the Admiral said, "and we needed a contagion to carry that resistance. You were it. We are better for catching it." Kepler laughed. It was rusty and it rang like a bell in a heavy hallway. "Some contagions keep you alive." Kale wrote that line down so the Empire would not forget. They did not end the Grey. How do you end a mistake that can occur again, born of hunger for purity? No, they learned to live so that it could not win. They made space for complexity where there had been columned clarity. They kept records that refused to be absolute. They taught their children to ask, what else could this be? And to answer with more than one thing. There were losses. There always are. Kepler lost a ship whose crew had turned themselves into a cordon of jokes and riddles, and had kept the Grey busy for an hour that saved a planet. The Empire lost a city that could not bend without breaking. In both cases, they did not bury the memories. They made use of them. They built a garden where the city had been, planted with seeds that grew in patterns that never repeated. They named new ships after the old in a language that added honor without simplifying the pain. The culture learned to hold grief in the same hand as a wrench. Kale grew older. He became an archive himself. Children asked him, "Were you there when the Grey blinked?" He nodded and told them about the smell of bread on a human ship, about the copper plaque, about how the Admiral's voice had sounded when she answered a monster, neither trembling nor triumphant, just certain that life wanted to stay alive and would, if given half a chance. Kepler grew older, too. Her hair went silver all the way and she wore it longer. She took to moving slower, not because she wanted to, but because she had learned that the fleet would move at the pace of her stride if she let it. She carried in her pocket a stone smooth from 1,000 thumbs. On the day an empire-wide holiday was proposed to honor the first contact at Castriel, Kepler sent a simple request to the Admiral. "No parades," it read. "Let them plant things instead, or fix something, or share bread." The Admiral issued a command that sounded like an invitation. The Empire planted and fixed and shared. An old grudge softened that day between three worlds. A new story began on a moon where engineers had been too proud to ask gardeners for help, and learned that their hydroponics would not thrive without someone who knew how to talk to plants. Kale went back to Castriel often. He would stand on the viewing tier with the new archivists, younger and brimming with different fears, and he would lay his palm on the glass. "Remember," he would say, "when the dark looks like it wants to rewrite you, remember that you can write back. Remember that your wrench can be memory, that your law can be mercy, that your bread can be a treaty, that your stone can be a plan. Remember that we are never one thing, that is our oath. He would tell them how a myth had docked with a station and proved to be less than the stories and more than them. He would tell them how the world had not ended when the Grey came, because ending is also a story and you can refuse to tell it. On a night when the stars were quiet like satisfied diners and the fleet's hum had the quality of sleep, Kale sat with Kepler and they watched the galaxy turn like a tired animal finding a better position. "I keep thinking," Kale said, "about how scared we were when we first saw you. That armada coming without slip or courtly greeting. We thought you would be swords, you were rope." "We're both," Kepler said, "but rope holds more." He looked at her hands. They were scarred, the knuckles bigger than their first design. They were hands that had coaxed engines, steadied frightened shoulders, broken stubborn seals, and held bread. "I have one selfish question," he said. "Ask. Do you miss the speed?" She considered. "Sometimes I do, but now, sometimes we stop on purpose. On purpose is better." She smiled sideways. "We found something faster than engines. Trust moves quicker. Maybe that's how we outran it at last." Kale nodded. He thought of the Admiral asleep at last in a chair that knew her shape. He thought of the children who had learned to play games where the rules changed because someone new had joined. He thought of the Grey somewhere in the far dark, trying to digest an unpalatable banquet of cultures that refused to plate themselves simply. He felt old in a good way. He felt like a bridge that had carried enough and could carry more. The galaxy did not become a paradise. It became livable, which is more real, which is better. The Empire shed some of its glitter and gained texture. Humanity shed some of its desperation and gained rest. Between them, they taught other species that their own myths could be tools. A century after Castriel, a ship came to the rim from a world none of them had noticed before. The ship's name translated as if only. Its captain was a being whose voice hummed like bees in foil. They asked for help against a hunger that ate meaning. The combined fleet did not flinch. They had a bright braided answer ready, composed of laws and laughter and levers that stuck though they were old. They had bread to break. They had equations with room for doubt. They had stones to place and ropes to throw. The captain of If only cried in a voice like rain and called them strange and wonderful. And the promise chain grew longer. Years turned. People died and were remembered in ways that would have made the Grey gag because the meanings multiplied instead of narrowing to a single epitaph. Ships were born new. Castriel's glass thickened with plaque marks from palms pressed in ceremony. The copper plaque on Kale's robe wore thin. He had to replace it one day, and when he went to the human workshop for a new one, the artisan looked at him and said, "Take two, pin them cheap if you must," and winked because a plaque could be a sign and a joke. Kale took two. And on mornings when the river at Oral threw up mist like the breath of an animal, the Empire's elders would sniff and say, "Wind over wet iron," and the children would say, "That means the day will be held together by will," and their teachers would say, "That also means the day will fall apart beautifully and be mended." And the children would nod because they had learned to keep both. In a hall without windows, Admiral Arvane, older and grand, spoke to new officers. She lifted a hand not to outline lines of battle, but to demonstrate how to make tea when a system fails, because nothing resists erasure like hospitality. She told them to carry two knives, one for cutting rope and one for cutting pride. In a corridor that smelled faintly of bread, Commander Mara Kepler paused at a porthole and watched a slow convoy of garden barges glide past like whales. She had allowed herself an hour off her feet because even motion needs rest. A child running by crashed into her knee and mumbled a sorry that sounded more like a song. She ruffled the child's hair and felt like a planet's gravity for a heartbeat and like a cloud the next. In an archive lit by amber columns, Kale Erix filed a new entry under the heading, "Tools that mean more than they say." The entry reads simply, "People, The Grey kept existing somewhere. That was fine. It could exist. It could not have everything. The rest belonged to those who kept going. Headphone, if you're enjoying this story, take a second to like and subscribe. It really helps keep humanity's stories alive among the stars. On a winterly night, with the fleet at anchor in a cinder belt lit by a dying star whose light fell brittle as dried leaves, Kepler found Kale on a catwalk. He was sitting with a blanket and an expression that said he had been thinking too long. "Archivist," she said, mock formal. "You look like a man who needs a story told at him." "Always," he said. She told him about her grandmother, who had been a child on a ship where every screw had a name. They named them so they would not forget that taking one out took time, Kepler said. They named them so the Grey would find it hard to turn a screw into only a fastener. They named them so a child could talk to a wall and the wall would listen. It's silly, isn't it? "It's holy," Kale said. She nodded. "Same thing, different day." They watched the cinder belt roll. Fragments of old planets spun. Some pieces were square from ancient cuts. Some were curves where gravity had worn them smooth. The Empire had plans to turn the belt to a string of habitats. Humanity had plans to leave some pieces as they were, to remember bite marks and scrapes. Between those plans, something like wisdom began. "I keep a stone in my pocket," Kepler said. "I've seen you touch it before hard choices," Kale said. "It's from the floor of a ship that barely made the traverse," she said. "It's ugly. It reminds me that ugly is fine if it lives." "May I?" he asked. She put the stone in his hand. It was indeed ugly. It felt warm. "You plan to live forever?" he asked, cheeky enough to get away with it. "I plan to help others do," she said. "That's the best immortality I've found that doesn't taste like ash." He gave the stone back. "I plan to remember," he said. "Same job," she said, "different day." When they parted, none of the watching crew spoke. Some tradition had formed that you did not narrate the moments that keep cultures from fraying. You put them in the archive not with noise, but with care. In the inner worlds, there were critics who wrote essays about the barbarization of the Empire, about how jars of screws with names had replaced clean design. They were not ignored. They were debated. Kepler and the Admiral read their essays and considered them carefully, because the Empire could not lose its grace entirely. The balance, they understood, was not between clarity and chaos. It was between clarity that allowed room for change and chaos that allowed room for kindness. When the critics wrote well, they were invited to teach. When they wrote badly, their pages were repurposed as sweeping documentation, which is a kind of mercy. One day, a small fleet arrived under a banner no one recognized. Their ships were sleek in a way that said they had never fought anything but boredom. Their admiral wore a cape. They requested to establish a trade monopoly on ambiguity, an absurd request, but their lawyers had sharp quills. The Empire's court invited them in, gave them rooms with good light, and then invited human children to the proceedings to play with toys that made laws into games. The visitors grew confused and then amused and then humbled. They went home with no monopoly but with an affection for bread baked in machines that knew the names of their screws. They sent back a letter that read, "Teach us more. Lessons carried." The promised chain wrapped the galaxy not like a fence but like ribbon on a present no one had expected. The Grey kept trying. It could not stop. It was what it was. But the ribbon made the present hard to unwrap. Kepler found herself in old age at Castriel again. She stood at the dock where her ship had first opened to an empire without parades. The copper plaque still hung on a bulkhead, no, another plaque, because the first had been worn to thinness by fingers. This one carried the same words in deeper etches. We kept going. She touched it. Her hand trembled, not from fear, from fullness. Kale was waiting. He was older too, and his robe clinked with little additions. Small tools, small toys, a pen that was also a screwdriver. They stood together and looked at the viewing slit as they had done 1,000 years ago. No, only decades. Time is a trick, but it has polite manners when asked. You came slow, Kale said. I could afford to, Kepler said. They stood a while, the station hummed, the Empire breathed. Humanity rested without shame for the first time in its long fleeing history. What next? Kale asked. Same as always, Kepler said. Keep it from collapsing, keep it from hardening, keep it from forgetting. Fix beams, bake bread. Welcome the scared, scare the cruel without turning into them. Teach the children to be two things at once and then three. Teach the elders to be soft where they think they must be hard. Keep going. Kale smiled a slow smile. We have a saying in the archives, he said. It was born from the day you arrived. Oh. He spoke it in the Empire's lingua and then in human words, and then in a mix that would have baffled a machine that needed clean inputs. He spoke it so the station's walls might learn it for those who would never read the archives because they were busy living. And that day, the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, thank you for listening. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.